welcome to Dialogue. Japan's cabinet has approved a record-high military budget for fiscal year 2026, topping 9 trillion yen, a 9.4% increase from the previous year. The spending plan prioritizes enhanced strike capabilities, expanded coastal deployments with new vessels and drones, and broader military modernization. The move appears to be part of a wider shift in Japan's security posture, and Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, the ruling coalition, is easing long-standing restrictions on arms exports and even signaling the possession of nuclear weapons, issues once considered politically untouchable. These steps follow recent remarks that Japan could intervene militarily in China's national reunification process between the mainland and Taiwan. So are these measures purely defensive adjustments, or do they signal the early stages of a deeper strategic transformation? And what does Japan's evolving military posture mean for its neighbors, many of whom still carry painful memories of Japan's militaristic past? Join us for today's discussion. Live from Beijing, I'm Xu Qinduo. Well, joining me today are Victor Gao Zhikai, Chair Professor from Suzhou University, Professor Ana Rosario Malindaguay, Director and Vice President for External Affairs of the Asian Century Philippines Strategic Studies Institute, Professor Peter Kuznick, Director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at the American University, and Dr. Slobodan Popovic, Research Fellow from the Institute of International Politics and Economics. Welcome to the show. Well, Anna, I will start with you. People would ask, looking at the recent changes, is Japan crossing a line? Let me start with this broad picture. Under Prime Minister Takaichi, Japan is increasing military spending, easing arms export control, and talking about, possessing nuclear weapons, and also toughening its rhetoric toward its neighbors. Is this still about self-defense, or are we witnessing a fundamental shift toward rearmament?
As far as I'm concerned, the current pronouncement and also some kind of military upgrading signaling of Japan, for me, it's not anymore, I think, about self-defense, but it's much more, I think, a reinterpretation of the post-war structure and also a post-war position of Japan. And I'm kind of worried about these things at the moment because, it may provoke some kind of an arms race probably in the region. And also, it's also some kind of alliance signaling with the United States, given that the United States, as we know, even though in its national security strategy, there was like some kind of downgrading of its containment strategy against China. But I think this is more also about alliance signaling. And also, when you talk about messaging thus far for East Asia, to China, this means Japan is preparing for high-intensity contingency, including the Taiwan-related scenarios, and also for ASEAN and Korea. It seems that this is also some kind of a message that Japan pacifist constraints I effectively reinterpreted. So I really don't see it as a self-defense, but more of recalibration of Japan's post-war status or post-war military posturing at the moment.
Victor, how would you define Japan's strategic direction today?
Thank you very much. I think what Prime Minister Takaichi is doing is truly triggering the re-rise of Japanese militarism. This is very dangerous. Their real intention is to really overturn the verdict of Japan's unconditional surrender back in 1945. We know that Japan now has a pacifist constitution, but that constitution is required of Japan because it unconditionally surrendered in 1945. And Japan shall never be allowed to rearm itself to constitute another threat to countries like China. We lost 35 million people at the hands of the Japanese aggressors in the 30s and in the 40s. And I want to tell everyone in Japan, Japan shall never be allowed to develop and possess nuclear weapons. The moment Japan possesses nuclear weapons will be the moment of annihilation of Japan as a state. So don't play with fire. And don't forget that in the United Nations Charter, there is this very important enemy state clause, which means that Japan can never constitute another threat or to threaten to use war against the victor nations. Otherwise, the victor nations are justified to strike at Japan if it constitutes another threat without the need to consult with the United Nations Security Council. So I would say we are reaching fast a moment of truth, whether Japan should be allowed to overturn its verdict of unconditional surrender and whether peace-loving countries should unite to put a complete stop to this kind of eagerness to re-rise the Japanese militarism or even Japanese fascism. Allow me to emphasize another point. Unlike Germans after 1945, Japan has never completely severed its association with the Japanese militarism and the Japanese fascism. They keep worshipping the ghosts of the war criminals who were hanged by the Far East Military Tribunal. So this is, again, a moment of truth. Japan should never be allowed to continue association with the Japanese fascism, period.
Well, Slobodan, we have like a Dr. Popovich. If you compare, picking up what Victor said, if you compare Japan and Germany, is that something people can accept, like in European countries or in Germany? You have a revisionist, ultra-conservative, right-wing politician somehow become the leader of the government or the leader of the nation, and who denies basically the crimes of Hitler.
Currently in Europe, we are witnessing and we can testify the rise of the right wing, which is not a good trend currently in the Europe, which is facing with the great economic crisis. Even Germany is now at the very beginning of its economic recession. When it comes to the comparison between Germany and Japan, I totally agree with what already Professor mentioned. But when it comes to Japan, the state whom did so many atrocities towards its neighboring countries, particularly towards China and in China, if we remember the reason why Japan withdrew from the League of Nations, that cannot be conveyed as a message that can be understood as a positive signaling in de-escalating and recalibrating the regional context and geopolitical order in a very good and positive sense and context, and that kind of behavior cannot also be understood as a driver towards the stable future and the predictable behavior.
Mm-hmm. Well, Anna, we mentioned this nuclear weapons here. That's from a senior official from the Prime Minister's office who recently suggested, Japan should possess nuclear weapons. Was this a personal slip of tongue or a calculated trial balloon, to test the public opinion, international reaction here?
The remark, actually, I've also noticed that. But for me, as far as I'm concerned, the remark by a senior official from the Prime Minister's office suggesting that Japan should possess nuclear weapons should not be dismissed as a casual personal opinion, nor should it be overinterpreted, on the other hand, as an imminent policy shift. I think it sits in a deliberate gray zone. It's like a classic trial balloon testing. It's kind of testing domestic, regional, and alliance reaction to the ideas that were once politically radioactive or politically unaccepted in these levels. So it means that it's like a testing kind of statement. I'm trying to see if what will be the reaction of the domestic audience, the regional audience, and even the alliance with reference to the United States. However, one thing that we have to remember, as far as I'm concerned, is that Japan has three non-nuclear principles. first and foremost, after the Second World War, it agreed, or it has this principle of not possessing, not producing, and not permitting nuclear weapons on its territory. And one more thing, it has obligation under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So all of this kind of of statement, or this particular statement, I think it's more about testing the waters, how people will react to it. However, as to the possibility of it, I would agree with Professor Gao that Japan should never even consider, or should not even think about it, because that would not be good for the region. That will not, be good in terms of perception of how Japan is positioning itself strategically. And I think this will also signal that other countries in the region should also be, pursuing to have nuclear weapons. Which, as far as ASEAN is concerned, we have what you call a non-nuclear weapon zone, and and ASEAN should be a non-nuclear free zone, and at the same time a zone of peace. So this is not good to hear, but I don't think, but I think that Japanese people will have a double thought in trying to pursue this.
Well, Victor, Prime Minister Takaichi has also said Japan would not rule out nuclear-powered submarines. Well, it's not only exact nuclear weapons, but nuclear-powered submarines. Beyond technical capability, what message does this send?
I think there are politicians or people in Japan who can have really the wildest imaginations or fantasies. That's one thing. The most important thing is the international community should tell Japan that as a country which unconditionally surrendered, Japan shall never be allowed to possess nuclear weapons, to possess military means to such an extent that it will be constituting another threat to the victor nations back in 1945. This is the basic point. It's not whether Japan wants to develop a nuclear weapon or not. It's the international community should not allow Japan to develop a nuclear weapon or other massive weapons of mass production, destruction without consequences. That's why I say we are reaching a moment of truth. Now, for the nuclear-powered submarine, this is truly a misnomer, because by the end of the day, it really depends on what kind of bombs or missiles you put into the tube. Whether the submarine itself is nuclear-powered or not, it's just one side of the equation. And in the heat of a battle, who can really be sure that for a nuclear-powered submarine, the missile you put into the tube to be fired will be conventional warhead rather than nuclear warhead? Therefore, I think this is truly a slippery slope. And the point is that as a country which unconditionally surrendered back in 1945, Japan should never indulge in fantasy that it should keep arming and rearming itself to such an extent that it will constitute threat to countries it invaded, it committed atrocities, it committed crimes against humanity, and Japan should always remain as a country devoted to peace rather than rearming itself and a reconstituting threat to countries like China.
Dr. Popovich, we know that this non-nuclear principles sort of has defined the identity of Japan since World War II. But with the recent, discussions, debate, or whatever trial balloons from the politicians, are you seeing that somehow these principles are being hollowed out or being weakened to a certain degree? I mean, that's let's say a slippery, like a down road. I mean, to something more dangerous.
Yes, that is for me direct way to the hell if that happens. However, I would like to continue to what Professor Anna just mentioned. This is like if that is like the personal opinion stated by one senior official that, who works and who is directly involved in the job and the creating of public policy of the current premier of Japan, of that such powerful country, and that there was no any kind kind of reaction from that same cabinet, that means that gives us an impression of some kind of an unprofessional and non-ethical behavior that cannot just be completely equal to just analyzing the pulse and opinion of public opinion on the territory of Japan and spanning the globe. I also would like to continue what my other colleague in this panel mentioned, that this fantasy is the continuation of worshipping the spirits of war crimes and war criminals, all the atrocities they did. And I do believe that Japan is a peace-loving nation, which is also confirmed in its constitution and under the security umbrella of United States. That is the catch which should be involved when we are doing analysis of the future behavior of Japan. When it comes to loosening these principles, I think that they should not be loosened at any point, and I'm quite sure that there will be a great resistance of the domestic audience, not only from the abroad of the international community, that has to be involved in de-escalating and appeasing these Japanese, let's to say, freely fantasies about reordering not only regional but also the global order, but once again under the security umbrella of the United States of America, while China is still rising to the level of global power. I think also that this will not be given, and they will not will have a consent from the public, from Japanese public, due to the traumas from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They suffered a lot. Then due to the three non-nuclear principles that they just must not be loosened at any point. Also, they are deeply rooted now in the pacifist identity that has not to be changed at any level. So I'm quite sure that this is only like the warning in some point to China and its continuous rise and its ambitions of America to contain China. For me, it is now very important to notice the change of narrative here that also should be involved, that is not China who is challenger to the stability anymore. There is Japan who is a challenger to stability and who is bringing new uncertainties while the world is entering the global reconfigurations in which some countries want to reshape global order, some of them want to keep it unchanged, and some of them want to change it completely, which they believe to be better global order.
Mm-hmm. Well, Peter, welcome to the show. We are talking about, obviously, the Japanese, recent let's say, upgrading or increase of military spending, the record high already being approved by the cabinet so far. And of course, together with the recent talk of possessing nuclear weapons or having nuclear-powered submarines, and also probably, the concern of hollowing out non-nuclear principles, arms export, all the recent developments. What do you make of the Japanese strategy or strategic recalibration? What's happening here? What's going on?
Japan has become increasingly right-wing and nationalist. Since my friend Hatoyama-san was ousted, so the Japan Democratic Party was in power from 2009 to 2012. But since then, we've had a string of conservative right-wing governments. But Takaichi is probably the most extreme. She's a disciple of Shinzo Abe, and she's an admirer of Margaret Thatcher. She likes the name the Iron Lady, and she's been part of this group, what's the name of it, Nippon Kaigi, which is the extreme right-wing group. They're history deniers. They want to get rid of Article 9 of the Japanese Peace Constitution. They're open to developing nuclear weapons. So they're really extremists. What I'm glad to see in the recent polling is that the Japanese public is still opposed to developing Japan's own nuclear weapons. The polling was 46.6% against and only 28.2% in favor. So that's a reassuring sign. But we know that Japan is what we call a screwdriver twist away from having nuclear weapons. They've got a massive stockpile of plutonium, and they've got the scientific and technological know-how. And now we see this latest budget is almost a 10% increase over a year ago. So Takaichi has said that she wants to reach the 2% of GDP figure of spending on the military 2 years ahead of schedule. They're talking about, and Trump wants this, Japan to get up to 3.5% of GDP. So you put that all together with the new national security strategy that the United States adopted, which might be a little more reasonable in terms of Russia, but is certainly not in terms of China or Latin America. So they're doubling down on the air-sea battle plan, and this discussion of new battleships, nuclear-armed battleships, is simply another part of this doubling down on the air-sea battle plan, which calls for striking decapitation strikes inside of China, as well as embargoing in the sea. So the First Island chain is still going to be central to U.S. policy. So Taiwan fits right into that. So I'm very worried about what's going on. Takaichi's comments that if China used force to take Taiwan, that would be an existential threat to Japan. That Japan is supposed to have the same kind of strategic ambiguity and one China policy that the United States is supposed to have. But Takaichi seems to be contradicting that and creating a very, very tense situation in the region with the U.S. support. So I'm very disappointed to see these developments.
Well, Peter, I want you to talk more about the recent spat between China and Japan. Tokyo often cites tensions with China as an excuse to justify its military spending, to justify its expansion over there. But as you said, it's really Takaichi, talked in a way, let's say at least the controversial way about the Taiwan issue. That, for the first time in history, that led to the recent tension between the two sides. Of course, the U.S. concerned on the side, but it's like they are exploiting the situation to develop militarily. Is that the case?
That's absolutely the case. And we can broaden it out a little because the exact same thing is going on in Europe now. We've got every head of state, especially the important ones, and the intelligence community and the militaries in Europe doing the same thing, saying that if Russia gets a win in Ukraine, then they're going to move against Europe and gobble up one piece of Europe after another. Again, trying to scaremonger, frighten the public into thinking that there's this great threat. So they've got to sacrifice the social programs that they really need, the housing, the health care, the food programs, the education, and put the money instead in military spending. And that's a crazy way to go about things. And it just raises the tension and makes it a more dangerous world. We're not that far from the possibility of warfare in either Europe or in the Pacific. And, we know the U.S. plan is to use nuclear weapons if that happens. The United States is far away from Taiwan. Admiral Davidson said that it would take the U.S. 3 weeks to get its forces to Taiwan. So what is the strategy? It's to have Japan and South Korea intervene immediately. And so that's why what's happening with Japan is so dangerous now, because the Chinese officials know that that's U.S. strategy to send Japanese forces and to send South Korean forces immediately in order to either break the blockade or confront Chinese forces in the region. And so this is simply what's going on now is simply reinforcing that. And Takaichi's statements go against Japan's previous policy, but also her statements about the three nuclear principles or non-nuclear principles. Onodera, a former defense minister, supports her, and others in the right wing of the Japanese government and polity right now are supporting her. So many of them really want to see Japan develop its own nuclear weapons and also to allow the U.S. to bring nuclear weapons on U.S. ships, as used to be the policy. So again, we're just escalating. Tensions are ratcheting up, and the one incident could trigger a military action. We don't want to see that, certainly. Could be a disaster.
Peter, also, you mentioned about the opinion polls. Many people in Japan, they would say when they face criticism against Takaichi, they would say she enjoys high approval rating inside Japan, more than 70%. What do you make of that?
It's early. I mean, I think people like the idea of having a female head of state for the first time. And she's trying to do some big things with the economy. And the Japanese economy has been stagnant for a long time. So they're giving her the benefit of the doubt. It's a kind of a honeymoon period right now. But they don't like this militarism. They don't like this hawkish attitude toward China. I think that her popularity is going to go down. Her cabinet's popularity has already been dropping. So the disapproval rating for her cabinet has gone up 4% for disapproval rating very, very recently, and the approval rating has gone down. So I think that her hawkishness is going to backfire. And as we saw, the Japanese have been pacifistic, at least in principle, not always in practice. But they revised their strategy in 2015 to allow for the self-defense forces, so-called, to actually assist their allies militarily throughout the region. But Japan has had this wonderful constitution that the U.S. helped write right after the war that said that Japan's military should never be used for aggressive measures, that war was outlawed, and that it was going to be a pacifistic nation. And the Japanese clung to that, even when during the Korean War, the U.S. put pressure on them to drop Article 9 and come to the U.S. assistance, and then during Vietnam. But more recently, they've become more and more hawkish, more militaristic. They're doubling their defense spending, and they're going to want to go up much, much more. And that's what Takaichi represents right now. So I think it's, very alarming.
Yeah, very alarming change there. Maybe, Anna, that's why, many in the region, react nervously to Japan's military expansion. Is this fear, you think, exaggerated or rooted in unresolved history and the current policy choices?
I think many are reacting to what Japan is trying to do at the moment, though it's not yet there. It's more of a military. It's more of a signaling, precisely because of the historical background of Second World War. And one thing that I would want to state here is that my country is also part of the Second World War, and we suffered a lot from the Japanese invasion of the Philippines and the Battle of Manila. So, and also my concern about this, some kind of reinterpretation of the post-war security architecture of the region because of this Japan saying that it would want to have a nuclear acquisition of nuclear weapon is precisely because of the fact that my country and Japan has what you call the RAA, or the Reciprocal Access Agreement, which in many ways is like Japan can actually reposition military assets in my country and also can send their troops in my country. And as what explained earlier by our colleague, that in the NSS, or the National Security Strategy of the United States, the first island chain is very much prominent. And one thing that we have to remember, in the first island chain, my country, the Philippines, is kind of it. So it's really a worrisome as far as I'm concerned.
For another show. Many thanks to all of our guests. With that, we come to the end of today's show. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.